Evaluating some of the 25 players on the Seahawks injured list, Roman Torres returns to Seattle and another Q&A segment. Let's take it around the sound. Hello everyone and welcome back to Around the Sound. We have episode 7 today, so welcome back if you are a returning listener, and of course, welcome to Around the Sound if you've never been with us before. Overall, it was a really slow news week this week here at Around the Sound. There wasn't too much going on. There wasn't too many midweek games. Obviously, the Mariners already wrapped up their season. There is baseball playoffs going on. The Astros eliminated the Twins in their best-of-3 game series. They wrapped up that series, and so to the avail of many baseball fans who are in favor of playing by the rules, I think they were unhappy to see the Astros go through. The Astros will play the Athletics in the next round, who bounced out the Chicago White Sox, so a few AL West teams having success in the American League so far. If you like Around the Sound, be sure to tell your friends. I'm trying to grow my podcast, grow my brand, so if you like listening to me, you like listening to the podcast, please tell your friends about it. Help me grow. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at @ThePeytonThomas. Keep up with everything that I'm involved with, and don't miss a beat as far as the podcast goes. Follow the podcast Instagram account, which is at Around the Sound Seattle. Every episode of Around the Sound is on YouTube in video format at PTOM Media. That's at PTHOM Media. If you prefer to watch all of the episodes, if you prefer to listen to all the episodes, you can find Around the Sound wherever you get your podcast. I want to send a shout out, thanks to everyone who submitted questions this week for this episode's Q&A. I know we had a Q&A earlier in episode 3 or 4, earlier in the early days of Around the Sound. We're still in the early days, but the even earlier days of Around the Sound. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We'll go through hopefully a few of those at the end of the episode. We'll see how much time we have left. But let's hop right into sort of the Seahawks injury problems. This week, there were 25 players listed on the Seahawks injury list, which to somebody, an outside eye that doesn't know the details, that's a staggering number for one NFL team through week 3. But I really want to be clear, the Seahawks injury problems compared to that big 25 number at the front of the injury list are very minor as a detriment to the team. It's not like the Seahawks are in a position like, say, the 49ers or the Giants where they're really missing a lot of their main players, their key pieces, out for the year. I mean, the 49ers dealing with Nick Bosa, dealing with Solomon Thomas. The Giants lose Saquon Barkley, which is basically their entire offense. The Seahawks have not really lost any of their main players, either on offense or defense. The one real exception to that rule might be Bruce Irvin. The only two sort of starters that went out with season-ending injuries was Bruce Irvin and Marquise Blair. Bruce Irvin are probably the best pass rusher, the most experienced pass rusher that the Seahawks have, or had, I should say. They drafted him in 2012. He left after a few years, bounced around the league. He went to Oakland for a few years. I think he was in Carolina. He makes the return. Seahawks pay him plenty of money, only to be injured in week 2 against the Patriots. He's on IR. Marquise Blair is on IR, out as well in that Patriots game. He was sort of taking a handful of snaps each game, sometimes on those crucial third downs. He's the third safety that sat behind Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams when one of those guys needed to come out for a snap. Maybe you wanted to drop deeper in pass coverage, and Jamal Adams is more of a run-stopping safety first. You're going to normally put Marquise Blair in that strong safety position for that third down to defend against the pass, drop back in coverage. With Marquise Blair gone, obviously you have to rely on other guys. Maybe you send in Jamal Adams for yet another snap in those circumstances, although he's a part of the injury list too, or you stretch further into the backups of your secondary. But we'll go through that in a little bit. Let's go over sort of the biggest question marks, though. We'll kind of go through the biggest players who still remain on that injury list. And as we go through this, I want to kind of remind everybody, this week the Seahawks play the Dolphins. Next week in week 5, they play the Vikings, and then you have the bye week, week 6. So you don't really play anybody as good as the last few opponents that you've played. I think the Falcons obviously have their own problems, but are still a very potent offense. The Patriots look like a pretty good team, and obviously the Cowboys gave the Seahawks quite a run in week 3. The Dolphins and the Vikings are not the same caliber of a team. Both teams have had significant struggles this year in picking up victories, and I think that as long as the offense and Russell stays consistent, you can get by these 2 games and get into that bye week and then make sure everybody's healthy without having to push guys back into the offense or defense too quickly and risk a re-injury. So let's talk about Jamal Adams first. Jamal Adams ruled out this week against the Dolphins week 4 with his groin injury that he had picked up last week. The way that Pete's been talking sounds like the target is for him to return next week, week 5 against the Vikings. Those snaps for Jamal Adams are probably going to go to Ugo Amadi, who's been playing safety. He's looked promising in some of the difficult situations that the Seahawks have put him in. He's young. We don't really know how well Ugo Amadi is going to step up to that next level. Or some of those snaps could go to Ryan Neal, who was activated from the practice squad the day of the game against the Cowboys, and Ryan Neal ended up being the hero in that game that basically sealed the Seahawks' victory with that interception on the second to last play of the game against Dak Prescott. Jordan Brooks, the rookie linebacker first-round selection of the draft last year for the Seahawks, he's going to be out this week. Pete said to the media that he had been limping and still has plenty of work to do before we'll see him again. Sounds like it's an MCL sprain, and when you have something with the ligaments, you really want to be cautious, especially with those younger guys. A lot of players take major knee or major ligament injuries such as ACL, MCL, PCL, and they're never quite the same player when they return, but that usually only happens when it's a full tear and in special circumstances. So with Jordan Brooks, I don't think that we're talking about anything super significant long term, but I'm sure Pete will not want to rush him back too soon so that something could happen long term. Obviously, if he's limping around in practice and then he does play against the Dolphins, which he's been ruled out, but let's say Pete pushed him and tried to get him back early playing against the Dolphins offensive line is going to know that he's limping, know that he's sitting on that injury, and are going to most likely attack him. Not in a dirty way, but if you're thinking about competing against those guys on the defensive side of the ball, he's a player you can go after because he is not playing at 100%. So obviously don't want to risk re-injury. Pete Carroll's going to play a little bit conservative here, play on the safe side. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see Jordan Brooks back until week 7 after the bye. He's not a major piece of this defense that you're going to. He doesn't run the system yet defensively. He's only a rookie, so I wouldn't be surprised to see Pete not play him against the Dolphins, already been ruled out, and against the Vikings next week as well. Head into that bye week and then make sure he's fully ready to go when the Seahawks are set to be back in week 7. Let's go to the offensive side of the ball now. We'll talk about Chris Carson, and I want to give an update on sort of the controversy and the gator roll tackle that we saw in week 3 against the Cowboys. Cowboys defensive tackle Tristan Hill injured Chris Carson essentially with a gator roll tackle. Many analysts, media, people surrounding the team, including Pete Carroll, thought this was really dirty tackle. Pete Carroll was up in arms about it, talking to the media about how it was a really dangerous play. Chris Carson definitely could have had a significant ACL injury or some other knee ligament problem that was much more significant than what it ended up being. And to the dismay of many in the media, to Pete Carroll and many of the fans, Tristan Hill was not fined by the NFL. He was not suspended. There was absolutely no word about the tackle, about the situation afterward, and nothing's really been said, which is a little bit crazy to me. I wonder if Tristan Hill got this lucky, avoiding the fines and avoiding the suspensions because Carson's injury was so minor. I think in many scenarios, Carson tears his ACL there. If the gator roll tackle had actually torn Chris Carson's ACL and he was out for the year, then I think that the NFL would have gone back closer and looked at the tackle and thought about issuing a fine or a suspension for the player. But since Chris Carson's injury was so minor, which in all seriousness was lucky for Chris Carson, since it was so minor, I don't think the NFL really looked that hard at it. Pete Carroll said that Chris Carson is most likely ready to go this week and should take, I would expect, a fraction of his normal snaps on Sunday against the Dolphins. I wouldn't expect the Seahawks to work him back in at his full workload, especially because you have capable people behind him like Carlos Hyde, who I would expect to take the majority of the workload, and you're also going to throw in Travis Homer on a few third downs here and there to be an option in the pass game. Let's talk about Damian Lewis, sort of my personal favorite new offensive lineman for the Seahawks. He was really performing at a high level before he went down against the Cowboys. He had been ranked by Pro Football Focus, PFF's, #1 rookie run blocker in the league. He was #6 run blocker overall in the NFL. He'd been playing really well, and he went down with a sort of a minor ankle sprain, so he's still recovering from the ankle sprain. Jordan Simmons was the lineman who replaced Damian Lewis after he had gone out and been carted off the field in that game against the Cowboys. Pete is probably going to keep Damian Lewis on the sideline for the majority of this game. Questionable or doubtful will probably be the ruling heading into Sunday, but I would be surprised to see Pete try to rush Damian Lewis back into the offense this soon, especially since Jordan Simmons did have a pretty solid game last week against the Cowboys. I didn't think he was the main problem of that Seahawks offensive line. For being a backup, I think he did all right when he was forced to step into that position. Let's talk about a few of the others. There are a few other notables, including Iupati at left guard, Posick at center. Both of those guys are still fighting minor knee injuries. So all three of the interior offensive linemen are not completely healthy. So I would imagine that we see some offensive line rotation throughout the game. If any of those guys play, Lewis, Iupati, or Posick, I can't imagine that they would be on a full set of snaps. I bet they'd be on a limited regiment, sort of only playing here and there. So we're going to see plenty of opportunities for the depth of the offensive line for the Seahawks coming in, rotating in and out of those both guard positions and the center position. Quinton Dunbar and Lano Hill also still dealing with minor stuff. I think Lano Hill's got a hip and Quinton Dunbar's got a knee thing going on, and both of those guys thin out the secondary, but that means more snaps for Ugo Amadi and Ryan Neal, who had been activated off the practice squad. We mentioned those guys when we were talking about Jamal Adams' injury. So secondary is going to be a bit thin. The offensive line is going to be a bit thin, but other than that, you aren't missing too much superstar talent, anybody that's going to change the entire landscape of the game. So now that we've covered kind of the injuries, we got those squared away, we got what the roster is sort of going to look like going into this Sunday for the Seahawks. Let's talk about how the Seahawks actually line up against the Dolphins, and we'll talk about the preview. The short answer to how the Seahawks line up against the Dolphins is really well. The Dolphins are still not a very good team. They were one of the bottom feeders last year. This year, they still don't really have it together. Excuse me. They drafted Tua in the first round, but they are starting Ryan Fitzpatrick, so Fitzmagic is starting at quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. He hasn't had a terrible year so far, but he hasn't been extremely productive. I don't think he's been quite at the level of the previous quarterbacks that the Seattle secondary and linebacking core has had to look at. They've had Matt Ryan, Cam Newton, and then Dak Prescott so far. I don't think Ryan Fitzpatrick is quite as good as any of those three guys. Should be the easiest game of the season so far. Out of the first 4 weeks, I think this is the one circled on the calendar that is probably you can chalk up in the win category, assuming everything goes right. If Seattle's able to stick with their game plan, if Russell's able to stay as consistent as he has been, I just don't see how the Dolphins are going to outpace the Seahawks offense, even with the defense of the Seahawks in the secondary being pretty beat up. The Dolphins are going to come out and attack in the pass game, so it should be another big test for the secondary. Seahawks' biggest real flaw right now is the pass defense. It's the pass rush and it's the coverage in the secondary. It's going to be those guys, Ryan Fitzpatrick and the Miami Dolphins offense, going into this game looking to throw the ball around, see if they can find similar success to the previous three teams, the Falcons, the Patriots, and the Cowboys, who were all able to throw over 400 yards against the Seahawks secondary. Seahawks offense, now that Lockett is back in form, had a big game against the Cowboys. Who do you really want to highlight if you're the Dolphins defense? Do you highlight DK? You put your best corner on DK? Do you put your best corner on Lockett? If you try to do both and play zone, the Hawks still have David Moore who can go out and make some incredible grabs like he did last week. Russ's weapons are sharp. They are locked and loaded. And assuming that Russ stays consistent, assuming that those guys are able to stay healthy and keep producing like they are, I don't see any way that the Dolphins defense is able to slow down the Seahawks offense. Note for the UW fans out there, for the Husky football fans, the Dolphins drafted Myles Gaskin in the 7th round last year's draft, and Gaskin actually beat out a few veterans for the number 1 starting running back job in Miami. So congratulations to the University of Washington football graduate Myles Gaskin. I'm sure Husky fans will be watching this Sunday to see how Myles Gaskin lines up against the Seahawks defense. Really encouraging for him and his NFL career coming out of the 7th round, being that young and getting the starting job over some notable running backs who had been productive for Miami last year. Let's shift into some Sounders news. We haven't really talked about the Sounders too much on Around the Sound in the last few episodes, but Roman Torres is returning to the Sounders. The Sounders return to the number 1 spot in the MLS power rankings this week, and they still sit atop the Western Conference. Schmetzer's going to keep bringing in reinforcements, though. He brought back Brad Smith a few weeks ago. I think that was the last piece of Sounders news that we actually covered on the show. Now the Sounders are bringing back Roman Torres with a trade with Inter Miami, a 2021 first-round draft pick straight up for Roman Torres, and this trade ultimately makes sense for both sides. Inter Miami's an expansion team, a new team to the MLS just this year. They're still putting the pieces together. They've got a very young team that hasn't really played together for a long time. First season in MLS, you're going to have some road bumps. Miami is sitting in the lower half of the Eastern Conference. Roman Torres went over to Miami in the expansion draft. He didn't really play out for a starting spot there quite as many Inter Miami fans had hoped, so he's going to come back over to Seattle where he knows the system fits in. Schmetzer loves him, the fans love him, so it seems like a good fit for Roman Torres as he sort of gets older and becomes a player that comes in every few games. Seattle has money, so I don't think losing the first-round draft pick is all that harmful to them. Compared to other MLS teams who really focus on getting talent through the draft, Seattle has one of the deeper pockets in the league, and when they need depth, they're just going to go to the transfer market and splash the cash. The draft picks don't mean quite as much for Seattle. That's not really how they've managed to build their teams over the last decade since they came into the MLS, quite as much as other teams have relied on those draft picks. But the weakest part of the current Seattle Sounders is those center backs. So Roman Torres, who I would not expect to start, but Roman Torres knows the system. He knows it well. The two center backs who I would expect to start, Arriaga and Yaimar, both speak Spanish. Roman Torres speaks Spanish. I bet Roman Torres is going to be sort of a mentor to those guys, showing them the system, showing them how to work better within Brian Schmetzer's system. And I think the hope for the Seattle Sounders now is that Roman Torres makes those guys better. He pushes both Javier Arriaga and Yaimar to be better center backs. And ultimately, that makes Seattle a very dangerous team heading into the 2020 playoffs. Like I said, they're on top of the West right now, in a great position to push towards the playoffs and even push towards that supporter shield at the end of the MLS season. Let's move on. We're kind of rapid changing the topics right now, but let's talk about the Seattle Storm. Seattle Storm are set to play the Las Vegas Aces. The Aces were down 2-1 in the series against the Connecticut Sun, a best-of-5 series. The Las Vegas Aces, who were the number 1 seed heading into the WNBA playoffs, came from behind 1 Game 4, 1 Game 5 to make it to the WNBA Finals. So the Storm swept the Minnesota Lynx in the semifinals, only had to play 3 games. Las Vegas Aces had to take the Connecticut Sun to 5. They ultimately scraped by, but you would expect the Storm to be a little bit more rested heading into the WNBA Finals. It's a number 1 versus number 2 seeded matchup yet again in the WNBA Finals. The Storm looking to add yet another championship to that impressive trophy cabinet, and the series begins Friday night, which is just in a little bit. I'm recording this on Friday evening, so by the time that you are hearing this, by the time the episode is up, Game 1 should be completed, and then the series will be well underway. Another last note on the WNBA Finals, it is a best-of-5, not a best-of-7, quite like the NBA or other finals. So best-of-5 there in the WNBA Finals. Let's shift into the Q&A this week. It's kind of the last thing we want to cover. We do have time to conquer at least a few questions that you guys ask. I wrote down a few of them here, so let's just get right into it with some of the things that you guys had for me today. All right, first off, is Kyle Lewis better than Ken Griffey Jr.? No, that's funny. That's a good question. I'm sure it was a joke, but good try. Obviously, it was a joke, actually. I mean, everybody, if you're a common listener here on Around the Sound, you know just how high I am on Kyle Lewis. He's a great ball player. He was incredibly fun to watch this year. It seemed like the kid did something special every single night for the Mariners, and with the Chicago White Sox crashing out of the playoffs, Luis Robert over in Chicago is done for the year, so it's not like he's going to have any other playoff fireworks. I think he did have 1 home run in that series against the Oakland Athletics, but Luis Robert and Kyle Lewis are the 2 main contenders for AL Rookie of the Year this year, but come on, man, Kyle Lewis has got to win AL Rookie of the Year. If you compare the numbers, it should be Kyle Lewis. In my opinion, Kyle Lewis is just quite the special player, so I'm crossing my fingers and hoping for that Kyle Lewis AL Rookie of the Year honors now that we are close to the end of the MLB season. Next up, would Damon Snacks Harrison be a good addition to the Seahawks? Snacks Harrison is the all-pro defensive tackle who played for the Jets, the Giants, and the Lions. Stories have been kind of circling around whether the Seahawks would go after Harrison, and he's been a great player in recent years. He started to slow down in Detroit. He didn't really like the situation he was in Detroit, wanted out, and defensive tackle, nose tackle, is a real position of need for the Seahawks, obviously not just in the run-stopping game, which is really Harrison's strong suit. He's a run-stopper first, but Harrison's also been a great pass rusher throughout his career, and that would also be a big boost to that Seahawks defensive line that, without Bruce Irvin, really doesn't have that much depth or that much experience. Seattle's going to be the first team that Harrison's going to visit. Every week that Harrison doesn't sign with the team, he's missing yet another paycheck, so I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to sign with the team relatively quickly, and Seattle's the first team that he's set to visit. So Harrison is currently in the COVID-19 quarantine guideline that the NFL has. NFL laid out some rules that free agent players that are going to visit teams have to do a quarantine for, it's like 5 or 7 days or something. So Harrison has gone into that quarantine period. Once he's finished with that period, he'll travel to Seattle, visit with the Seahawks, and there's a real chance that he ends up on the Seahawks roster. He really isn't what he was in his prime when he was with the Giants, but the Seahawks have some cap room to play with. This is a position of need, and if he drops his asking price a little bit on the salary, I think that he would be willing to drop that price to play on a contending team. And if he's on the Seahawks team, they're absolutely a contender. They're probably still a contender without him, but adding Harrison to a young, struggling D-line would be a huge addition to the Seahawks. Finally, if Herbert and Darnold had the same number of offensive weapons, who would be better? Who would be the better quarterback? I'm going to go with Sam Darnold. I think Justin Herbert looked good, but here's kind of some factors that you have to think about. Herbert, his only real NFL start was against the Chiefs, and the Chiefs are an offensive-minded team. They're similar to the Seahawks, where they're just going to outpace and outscore everybody. The Chiefs' defense is nothing particularly special. It's not bad. There's a reason they won the Super Bowl last year, but the Chiefs' defense isn't, I would say, one of the best in the league. And Herbert really surprised the Chiefs in that game. Remember, the Chiefs had prepared all week. They'd watched film for a Tyrod Taylor Chargers offense. There was a medical assistant on the Chargers who administered something to Tyrod Taylor the morning of the game and had apparently punctured Tyrod Taylor's lung or something crazy like that. So I'm sure that guy probably got fined or lost his job in the Chargers organization. But anyway, Justin Herbert, obviously drafted out of Oregon in the first round of last year's draft, was the backup and slated to start. And how Herbert was going to adapt to this offense was a mystery to the Chiefs and a mystery to the rest of the NFL. And they sort of had to adapt mid-game. They went into Sunday, that game, thinking that Tyrod Taylor was going to be the opposing quarterback they were going up against. Herbert has a little bit of that shock factor. The defense didn't really know how to adapt to him, and you saw that in his good performance. Herbert did play well, but I think that you definitely have to factor in the fact that the Chiefs weren't ready for him, they didn't prepare for him, and they didn't really know how he was going to work in that Charger offense. And Darnold has absolutely nobody around him. I mean, we saw on Thursday Night Football this week against the Broncos, the Jets are now 0-4, and that's not really Sam Darnold's fault, although he could have probably been better. I don't know half of the wide receivers that he was throwing to on Thursday Night Football this week against the Broncos. It seemed like a new guy was catching the ball, and I have no idea where a lot of these Jets receivers came from. They're young. The Jets are trying to find talent, but overall, Sam Darnold really doesn't have a great offensive line. He doesn't have a great base of players in skill positions around him that can make incredible plays. And Darnold has much more experience and has shown flashes of being a productive quarterback despite really having nobody around him. It's just that he needs more help in order to do that. If you talk about Herbert and the Chargers offense, the Chargers are still a pretty good team. They're in a tough division. They had a tough year last year, but the Chargers have a good offensive line. They have plenty of experience in skill positions, and I think that's what helped Herbert adjust to his first NFL game in his debut against the Chiefs. So I'm going to go with Sam Darnold. I think Sam Darnold is probably a better quarterback if you have the same number of offensive weapons. But I am really excited to see if Herbert gets more chances in that Charger offense, gets more game experience, because I think the Chargers are slated to start Tyrod Taylor again once he's back healthy. I do want to see how far Herbert can go if he can keep progressing, because he did look very good in that first game. All right, I think that's all the time that we have for questions today. So I do want to thank you one more time to everybody that submitted questions. I only got to a few of them today, unfortunately, but we will have yet another Q&A opportunity sometime soon. So I'm looking forward to that. It's always fun to interact with the listeners of the show, so that's why I love doing the Q&A segments. It's one of my favorite segments that I get to do here on Around the Sound. So make sure you keep up to date with the podcast on social media, on Instagram. The podcast Instagram is at Around the Sound Seattle. Make sure you follow that. Don't miss a beat here at Around the Sound, and follow me on Twitter. I'll reiterate, at the Peyton Thomas. All right, I'll be back on Wednesday with another episode for you guys of Around the Sound. But before that, I got Week 4 Seahawks-Dolphins to watch. We'll be watching the WNBA Finals, and we should have plenty to talk about by the time we get to midweek next week. So stay safe, and thanks for listening. I'll see you guys then.